afternoon to you all. I hope you had a nice break and some lunch and food for your body. Now we'll have food for our soul and our intellect. My name is IVAN VEJVODA. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and it gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Georgios Varouxakis, who is a professor of history of political thought at Queen Mary University of London, where he is also the co-director of the university's Center for the Study of History of Political Thought. Georgios is preparing a substantial monograph book on the question of the West, and that is what we will be discussing today. It will be published by Princeton University Press next year, so I guess you can maybe also order early copies if you are so interested, but I'm sure we'll have them here next year. Georgios has published extensively on British, European political thought, on John Stuart Mill, on the French Victorian, on the British Victorian view of France, and on French contemporary history as well. He has been professor at the Queen Mary University since 2006. So please welcome Georgios Varouxakis. This is a vast topic, Georgios, the idea of the West, and we've called it a short talk on a long story. And I hope that we can fit that long story in the hour that we have. And as our usual habit is, I will open it for questions and comments about 20 minutes before the end. Let me just give a sort of very cursory introduction to this issue. Of course, many of us have read Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, published in 1926. A contemporary politician called Joschka Fischer, whom I'm sure you all know, just published a book called, with the same title, Decline of the West. Husserl wrote about the crisis of European sciences in 1936, and yet we use this catchword, the West, basically to explain something that we understand as the culture and political society in which we live. And so we are here today with Georgios to unravel and unpack both the history, the different meanings, the polemics around the political, cultural, economic significance of the West. And I'd like simply to start with a question, because, you know, I Googled the West just a little while ago, and there it explains simply, well, by the West we mean North America, Europe, and a few countries on the other side of the world, Japan, Australia, and the rest. So give us, he's smiling already, give us a simple answer to the question, what is the West?
This is, of course, the question I was hoping not to have. This is where my usual excuse is, moi je viens d'un petit village, je suis paysan, c'est rien. But now it's taken up by Monsieur Barnier, who says he's paysan, so I cannot use it anymore. So given my title, joking apart, I have to answer. The West is none of the things one reads in when one Googles it, obviously. It is an idea. It doesn't exist as a geographical notion. It's moving around. It is not a political entity. There is no representative of the West, as our fellow Stephen Walt has written when he criticized Huntington. Civilizations don't make decisions. Governments of states make decisions. So the West is, first of all, an idea, a concept. Is that, therefore, a reason why you are wasting your time and you should be in the other room? I hope not, because it's a very potent idea. It has been used and is being used right now and is going to go on being used to all sorts of purposes, and therefore, who uses it, what they mean, what they want to achieve, and how it can be used in the future are extremely important political as well as cultural questions. So I don't want to go on because, you know, somebody who has just more or less finished a book that he's been working on for 13 years can tell you a lot about what it is. But I hope the short answer is it's an idea, it's a concept which has a long history, and the only way, therefore, for me to make sense of it and do something meaningful is a genealogy in the Nietzschean sense, or at least in the way I understand it through Raymond Geuss, the Cambridge philosopher, which is that you cannot define something with such a long history. Nietzsche said many crazy things, but he's right about that. You can only do a genealogical analysis of the different meanings, and through that you uncover the various accretions, the various meanings that have been building up one after another, trying to replace the previously prevalent meanings, but never completely succeeding. So from time to time, older meanings that had been defeated and replaced by newer interpretations and meanings resurface, depending on the context and the political purposes of whoever uses the term, in ways that are fascinatingly surprising. And that's the story I've been researching. I hope I said enough because I don't want to talk all the time.
That's great for the beginning. And your quote of Barnier, nous sommes tous d'un petit village, that's our friend Ivan always says that he's from a village. And that's a good way to start things. But okay, let's take you then to what I understand is the beginning of your genealogy, and that's the first use of the term West in this modern sense. Let me put it very briefly. And you attribute that to what's called the father of sociology, the French sociologist Auguste Comte. Take us through that beginning.
Thank you. Very good. Auguste Comte, I argue, and I have been arguing it for many years in articles, and nobody has challenged me on this so far. And I would have noticed by now if there was something wrong with my argument. Is the first person to have consciously, deliberately made a decision. This thing I'm talking about, by calling it Europe, which I've been doing since the 1820s, it's not going to work because Europe includes parts of the world that are not part of what I'm talking about. What he was talking about is the most advanced part of the world that, in his opinion, was now ready to accept his proposals for the reorganization of the elite of humanity, the vanguard of humanity, by accepting his positivism and the political project that he was proposing. I will spare you the details until you ask me, because the project is complicated but also fascinating in its surprises. So at some point he made a deliberate decision in the 1840s, early 1840s, to stop calling it Europe and to start calling it l'Occident, the West. And after that, as Wolf Le Pennis has shown in his book, Die Macht der Zeigen, Comte was very conscious of signs and the importance of symbolism. So he invented a flag, a name, symbols, common currency. He proposed everything. He liked to organize everything. So République Occidentale is always the top motto of everything he published as of the 1840s, and then his successors in France, in Britain, in Brazil. Before you start going to sleep, I have to stress, for those of you who are not historians, I have to stress this man who is now completely forgotten. If you go to a bookshop in Paris and look for Comte in philosophy, you will find other people, but Comte will be absent unless it's a second-hand bookshop. But between the 1850s, when some young people in Wadham College, Oxford, got obsessed with him and started promoting him in Britain, because he became more popular in Britain than in France initially, until definitely just after the First World War, Comte was one of the greatest influences in the world. You had to reckon with Comte. As Marx said, he wrote to Engels, I have to read this Comte guy because the English and the French make so much fuss about him. But then after reading him, he decided he preferred Hegel. The comparison speaks for itself. He was of that level of ambition and influence. The flag of Brazil today, forgive me, I will mispronounce Portuguese, obviously, you can see Ordem e Progresso. Why? Because in 1889, the Republic of Brazil was founded by Communist positivists. Czechoslovakia has similar stories. Many other republics have similar stories. So he was not anybody. Everybody. George Eliot was writing that she was reading the whole of his 4-volume Cours de Politique Positive and enjoying it immensely, and so on. Everybody had read Kant in the last part of the 19th century and early 20th. I could go on about his influence, but that's not the point. The point is to alert you.
What was he stating? What was the West for him?
Okay, so now you are going to be blamed for the details that I'll go to. The big idea is the following. There are some countries that have been growing together so much that you have to see them as a unit. And in his opinion, these are the nations since Charlemagne's empire, the countries that were under Charlemagne's rule. Of course, as a good Frenchman, he appropriated Charlemagne, Karl der Grosse, and considered him a French king. These countries, plus England and Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, most of which was not part of his empire, have been through the influence of being part of the Roman Empire, but then being part of the Catholic world and feudalism, and then being part of the bouleversement, the upheavals of the last 4 or 5 centuries since the Reformation and then Reformation, Renaissance, and Enlightenment. They have been part of the same historical development, so they should be seen as a unit. And he thought that, initially called it Europe, and then he started thinking, no, I have to call it something else because Europe includes Russia, includes the Ottoman Empire, includes countries that were not part of the same development. He made an exception, by the way. Even Kant, who was so Latino-centric, Mediterranean-centric, Catholic Europe-centric, he made an exception. Poland is in Eastern Europe, but it has been Catholic for 1,000 years, and it has to be also a part of the West from the beginning, and little Greece because of ancient Greece and its influence on Rome and so on. Kant was not keen on the Greeks because he was on the side of Demestre, and but he had to include them because of Rome and so on. The project was, and I'm aware that I'm deviating now, the big idea was you abolish the nation states, which are the result of Protestantism and all these unfortunate developments that destroyed the unity of Europe that existed under Catholicism and the Pope. You abolish that, and you create small republics of the size of Tuscany, Belgium, Sicily, and so on. La République une et indivisible. Listen to this. La République une et indivisible of the French Republicans has to be split into 17 republics. Even France has to be to auto-destruct. And so patriotism would work better, and the industry would work better. You give the secular government of these small republics to industrialists and capitalists who know how to run the economy. Because, of course, Kant wasn't interested in parliamentary democracy and these silly ideas of the metaphysical stage of European history. But the catch is there would be separation between spiritual and secular power, like in the Middle Ages, as he had read in Demestre's Du Pape, 1817. The difference now is the spiritual power, instead of being the Pope and belief in God as the glue that unites that world, it would be the Pontiff of Humanity in Paris, Kant himself obviously for the time being, and the religion of humanity would be the new glue that would unite all these people under a spiritual authority and a moral authority. The spiritual authority of the République Occidentale that would include all the 5 great nations of Western and Central Europe, plus their offshoots in the rest of the world, so both Americas, not just North America, but South America as well, because remember, for Kant, it's very important to have Latin countries in the West, and also their offshoots elsewhere, like Australia and so on. So the Europeans and their settlement colonies would become one republic, La République Occidentale, under one spiritual power that would be based in Paris, and the secular power would be separate and done at the small local level. He went into details that I will happily spare you because I'm not a sadist. I just have to add one thing, and this is the big catch. In the whole, I challenge you to find any publication in the last three decades. Maybe I will regret saying this in public because it's recorded, but the orthodoxy in the current scholarship on the idea of the West, when they don't anachronistically talk of the West as an idea since the Greeks and so on, which many people do, those who do make the distinction between what is the West as a self-description, what is the West as a self-conscious understanding, as opposed to what we now project as the West in our mind. Those who do study that history, they always invariably tell you it started for the purposes of British imperialism. It started in the 1880s and 1890s for the purposes of high imperialism to justify imperialism. They also add various other things that I will spare you, but this is a standard you will find. Well, of course, the West and Western civilization, or civilization tout court, has been used to justify imperialism a lot. But the idea of the West in particular, as opposed to civilization in general, or European civilization, or whatever, why the West? The first time an idea of the West was invented, and I repeat, in very thorough detail, which you will be spared, I don't think anybody, including Spengler, has spent so much time defining the West historically, and then a project for the future with all the details that he was proposing. So that was an acharnement, un projet acharnement anti-impérialiste. It was a passionately anti-imperialist project. Kant believed that in the positive stage that humanity is going to enter from now on, empires of conquest and violence and conquest in general is completely atavistic and anachronistic. What we need from now on is industry. He was, of course, one of the Saint-Simonians, although he and Saint-Simon
I was going to ask you
clashed because of their mad personalities. So for him, the future was industrialism, exploitation of the planet in the interests of humanity and so on, which is something we can discuss, of course. And therefore, empires have to be abolished immediately. France should immediately leave Algeria, as I said, destruct the French Republic and become 17 small republics. The British should immediately leave India, and so on. So far from it being invented for the purposes of imperialism, the initial invention of the idea of the West is passionately anti-imperial. Don't get me wrong. Meanwhile, there are an awful lot in Kant's project, an awful lot of things that are extremely unpalatable. But that's the catch, that certainly it was not imperialist.
So what's then, how did he define the quote-unquote barbarians that were not part of the West? What?
Yes, again, thank you for asking that, because unlike many liberals who are, with impeccable credentials, of course, would use that term and would, some of them, not all. For example, I've spent all my life saying John Stuart Mill supported the British Empire under certain conditions, which are usually forgotten, but he also was a passionate anti-racist in British debates. So I wouldn't put everybody in that category, but one can think of Tocqueville and others, and some very unpleasant things that they recommended on empire. Kant was only talking about it being a matter of how quickly you can admit. Thank you for asking, because I forgot one of the things I was hoping to say in this ultra-short, ultra-long introduction, which is that the plan was that the West is only a stage in the preparation of humanity for its unity. So it was obviously a very utopian project, but the plan was that the West would prepare through help, sympathy, but never through conquest or pressure or intervention, the rest of the world to join it. So he had all these elaborate plans. The Ottomans will come first. After the Crimean War in particular, he was very keen on the Ottoman Empire and how quickly it could be admitted. Then the Russians, then the Persians, and so on. And eventually the whole of humanity will become one republic, and the capital would move from Paris to Constantinople, the city between Europe and Asia, the city of the world's desire, obviously, and therefore architects would be very busy again because the churches of humanity would be pointing towards Paris up to then, and when the capital would move to Constantinople, they would start rebuilding the churches.
Which was once upon a time the capital of the West.
The Roman Empire. So, of course, the Roman Empire was constantly in his mind, yes.
Perfect. So, so what's the difference between the understanding of the West as seen by Auguste Comte, or those who saw it in the Roman Empire that included, of course, all of Europe, then Byzantium and the others. Is there a value substance to this different? Is it just geographical, or because Comte saw this potential of spreading the idea of the West to the whole world in different ways than imperial violence?
Marvelous. I'm not going to avoid the question. I hope to come to the question. If I don't, please don't let me get away with it. You're reminding me something crucial. Why did he choose this term? Because exactly as you are implying, the term was there. It was available. So one of my arguments in the book is that unlike what people now think, that Anglo-America is the core of the West, and there are some appendages here and there, France, Italy, the Scandinavians, and so on, Anglo-America is the last to join the West in terms of self-description. The Brits start talking about the West and themselves as Western later than the Germans and the French, and the Americans much later, because the Americans already had two reasons to be the last. One is they had a West that meant something else, the shifting frontier, and so the term was used for some other reason, and an extremely important reason, that the whole raison d'etre of the United States was opposition to British imperialism, and we are a city on the hill. We are a different compensation. We are going to be, they saw themselves as living history and building something new. So the last thing they would want in the first decades of the 19th century was identification with the European imperialist, aristocratic, semi-feudal empires. Their whole raison d'etre was, we are not like them. And the part of my argument is the way the West starts being used in America was invariably ex Germaniae lux. The chapter is called Ex Germaniae lux. It was Americans who went to study in Göttingen, Berlin, Heidelberg, Halle, who start, of course, being exposed to this language in Germany, and Germans who migrated to America, not least Franz Lieber, then Francis Lieber, who becomes the founder of American political science and much else. So one thing to stress is certainly it's a Franco-British thing in the early 19th century. Again, time is precious, and I'm not going to go into examples, although if you ask me, I will. But I'm not saying that Comte was the person who invented the term. I'm saying it's the person who took the term and built a whole apparatus and the whole political project around it, and the whole history behind it. He wrote extensively on why those nations are a cultural and political unit since the time of Charlemagne, Karl the Grosse. But the terribly interesting thing that you are alluding to is the term was there. Why was it there? Because of the division of the Roman Empire in the end of the 4th century into Western and Eastern Empire. The Western Empire, as you know, there are disputes as to the date, but very soon collapsed. It was conquered by the so-called barbarian Germanic invaders, right? When one of the Germanic Frankish princes, Charlemagne, becomes ambitious enough, powerful enough to unite a great part of the former Western Roman Empire under his rule, he happened to save the skin of Pope Leo III in Paderborn, so he has the Pope anointing him Roman Emperor at Christmas 800. Except nobody called him the Roman Emperor, because there was a Roman Empire in Constantinople, alive and kicking in uninterrupted continuity. Conveniently, it was run, on the throne there was a woman, Irene of Athens, so misogynism could help a little bit, but a couple of years later she was replaced by a man. So although he crowned himself Roman Emperor, everybody called Charlemagne Emperor of the West. All he could claim was that he was the successor to the Western Roman Empire. He succeeded in that. And to delegitimize the so-called Byzantine, of course that's a later name given to them retrospectively, they called themselves the Romans. To delegitimize the Eastern Roman Empire of Constantinople, they started calling them the Greeks in order for Charlemagne to be the Romans. But everybody called it the West. So the term was there, and it was a historical term over centuries of history in this part of the world. What is terribly interesting to me is Gibbon, for example, writes The Decline and Fall, an extremely long 3-volume book. The word the West is used hundreds of times. You don't need to count. But look how it's used. It's used as a description of a part of Europe and part of the world over certain centuries he's describing, as opposed to the Eastern Roman Empire that becomes the focus of his books and so on. But when he writes a peculiar essay that he puts on the end of one of the volumes, could the collapse of the Roman Empire happen to us now? It's extremely interesting to observe how he calls us. Us is Europe. His contemporary supranational cultural or civilizational unit that he wants to defend and says we are not going to have the same fate as the Greeks because we are, and he includes Russia in Europe, crucially again, for Kant later. So same with Condorcet. You will find Condorcet talking about l'Occident, but if you read carefully, you will see it's a historical period. When he talks of his own world, it's Europe. So I'm terribly sorry, I'm deviating, but now I'm coming to your question. What is crucial is that Kant found a term that had historical resonances, that had historical, cultural, religious, fuzzy but clear. It existed. It was available in German and French because of their past history in a way that it wasn't for the British so much, unless you were Gibbon and had lived in Switzerland and knew history well. So he, through elective affinities, he chose a term that he thought was describing the part of the world he was talking about and its history and its future. Okay. Did I answer the question?
You did, but let me since your subject is history of political thought, how much does the Renaissance and the Enlightenment have to do with the substance of what Kant puts into the West? So the individual, going beyond transcendental powers of religion, of others, and actually the exit of the individual onto the world stage with the modern democratic revolutions. And you rightly pointed out he was part of the utopian Saint-Simonians.
Thank you. Yes, he was ambivalent about all that. He accepted that that was exactly what the West was at the time. Kant wanted to do what many people in the 19th century wanted to do, to create a synthesis between the two rival extremes, in his opinion.
And he is termed a conservative, right?
Exactly,
We need to remember that.
So Kant can be seen as a kind of utopian socialist and at the same time arch conservative. So he criticizes, what you're talking about, he accepts that's what the West is, but he criticizes it. He says, la maladie occidentale, the Western disease, is that we have individuals who don't care about the past at all, don't revere the past and traditions and so on. He tries to create a synthesis between the revolutionary metaphysical doctrines of the 18th century that were good for their time, but now are not any longer needed. Now we have to build a new synthesis. So you cannot use weapons of war that were used to destroy the Ancien Regime as building, how does he call them? Tiles, as tiles for a new edifice. So he wants to create a new synthesis where individualism would be curbed by his religion of humanity. Among other things, he coined the term altruism. Vivre pour autrui, living for others, was one of his many mottos. So he wanted to reinstate some kind of moral glue through his religion of humanity. That, by the way, I forgot to say, was a kind of synthesis of other religions. So although it was completely imitating Catholicism, it was Catholicism without Christianity, as Huxley correctly said. In terms of its the equivalent of sense, it would include Mohammed, it would include Buddha, it would include all sorts of Eastern prophets and so on, and religious thinkers, people who benefited humanity and were doing good for the time in which they lived, when there was no time, when the circumstances allowed you only to do this, would be included. So again, a kind of ecumenical, really Catholic in the etymological sense of Catholic, which means universal, attempt to include the rest of the world. Brings us back to what I said earlier, attempt not to be imperialistic and so on. So he was ambivalent about that legacy, although he was, in the sense he thought it went too far. It has been too destructive. It was needed to destroy the Ancien Regime, but now I will give you the answer. My sociology now has a proposal for the future, and the future, he was part of what Spengler correctly said later. Only this Western Faustian culture has this idea of itself as a kind of finality. It thinks, so he was deeply Western in that respect. We are now, as Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonians, of course, they were going to abolish conflict. They were going to abolish political conflict. From now on, we will exploit the earth instead of fighting each other. So similar thing.
A version of the end of history, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Auguste Comte, by the way, has a monument and statue in the central Paris, in the Place de la Sorbonne, even though his books are not in the bookshops. Okay, let's move.
Yes, and I have taken many photos.
Okay. Let's move forward. So the concept...
Yes, the book is not about Comte. Comte gets 1/3 of a chapter out of 10 long chapters.
Let's take the whole issue forward. The concept takes a life of its own and it's very polemical. People see it as the ultimate imperialist, colonial, violent attempt to control the world. We have the post-colonial then struggles, the liberation movements. What is the health of the concept today?
Oh, now here I should use Je viens d'un petit village. Yesterday, Chris Clark, with his characteristic brio and unparalleled sense of humor, reminded us how many spooky similarities you can find between the current world right now and the moment he describes in 1848. I could say similarly that no matter how you try to avoid it, it becomes a very controversial, essentially contested, and dangerous topic to talk about. So I have to be careful what I say because you are recording. That intimidates me. So back to your question. Yes, does the concept... Well, I have a position which, unfortunately for me, I have to put in very few words without careful consideration of how diplomatically I put it, but it is the following.
Try.
There is a tendency by people who think they are being very critical of historical myths to surreptitiously and subconsciously perpetuate these myths. In the sense, we have a whole literature of classicists who very commendably criticize their predecessors in the 19th century for the imperialistic and Eurocentric myths they built in the way they interpreted the classics and how they projected themselves and their whiteness on Mediterranean cultures that were neither considering themselves white nor considering themselves Western nor European. All that is very true, and that's what classicists should be doing. But then they extrapolate from that, and they say, therefore, the whole concept of Western civilization, which has been built on this uninterrupted link to Athens and the grand narrative of Western civilization and so on, is equated with Western supremacism. That's all there is, and we have an obligation as classicists to protest about that and so on. I think that's where they take it a little bit too far, in the sense where they and I are at cross purposes. In the sense, the people I study in my book, who are hundreds and who have spent have written long books, and some of them have spent careers. Some people like Walter Lippmann and various other people appear in 3 or 4 chapters because they live a long life and they adjust and readjust to 2 world wars and Cold War and so on. The vast majority of these things, with extremely few exceptions, do not think that the West and Western civilization begins with Athens. Athens is something they see, and ancient Greece and so on, is something they see as having influenced parts of the baggage that they call Western civilization. The vast majority of the people I'm talking about begin Western civilization, including Huntington, by the way, more recently, and Spengler. Spengler's book was as the French Catholic conservative intellectual that I unearthed, because he was as important as Spengler in the interwar period was Henri Massy, a member of the circle of the Action Française and Charles Maurras. And of course, he wanted to create a different kind of Occident and defend it because it would big Mediterranean center, Franco-centered, Catholic-centered, Latin-centered, and so on. And he criticizes, first of all, Spengler for his attempt to kill the Greeks. Because Spengler's theory, let's not forget, is the Apollinian culture, the Western is the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this culture that we live in, the West, das Abendland, he calls Faustian, and it's a completely different culture, and it made the mistake of attributing too much to the ancients and so on. And part of his whole project is to abolish that so-called narrative, or grand narrative, that we all go back to Athens. Well, look at Huntington, as I said. All these people start Western civilization in the Middle Ages. They think of a kind of Catholic Europe and so on, which, of course, through being influenced by Rome, has an awful lot of things that it has also, that have influenced Rome through Athens and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, some people are banging at open doors if they prove that the ancient Greeks didn't see themselves as Western, which they didn't. Certainly, I can show you mistranslations of 21st century books, Harvard University Press, mistranslating Aeschylus, who says barbarians, and they say Eastern, and so you project a Westernness that he didn't feel. But, so, sorry, this is a long answer to your question, which is, there are many misunderstandings, and my hope is that by studying all the different meanings, and insisting that here I have given you so many examples of meanings resurfacing in political debates, I hope I'm doing a service to the quality of our discussion by not letting one of the many meanings of a term that prevailed, in a particular couple of decades in American university Western Civ curricula, to efface all the others. Do I have time to go to an example? A recent example.
Briefly.
Thank you. I expected that. 2017, President Donald Trump goes to Warsaw and gives a speech. Huge debates in America about his use of the West and Western civilization some 10, 15 times, although democracy was used only once. Many people said, of course, he's playing to the home audience and so on. Of course, they forget that he was talking to a Polish audience in Poland. I am not crediting Trump with any of this, obviously. I'm talking about Steve Bannon and his speechwriters. My book, for those who will honor me with reading, will show that they knew extremely well what they were doing. Poland had just joined the West recently. It was part of the kidnapped West of Milan Kundera and not least Czesław Milosz. And the speech went down extremely well in Warsaw in the summer of 2017. An amazing debate started in America, which I follow, with people criticizing and people, well, both all the people I study criticize Trump and don't like Trump, but they start debating whether the West means anything if it means modernity and so on, or if there is something that you can find meaningfully meaning something, and you do not allow Steve Bannon or Netanyahu, who now says he defends Western civilization, in every speech that's what he says, or anybody else you don't like, you don't allow them to own the meaning of terms just because you don't like them, because then they have won. If you let people, because as one of the debaters in the Atlantic magazine that I'm talking about, 2017, said, if you abandon meaningful terms just because they crossed lips that you don't like once, they have won. You let the bastards get you down.
And just, you mentioned Charles Maurras and France. In fact, just anecdotally, one of the very far-right French movements in the 60s, 70s calls itself l'Occident. So,
thank you. Thank you very much. Look at this. My notes. So to prove that he's right, look at this.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to not forget, Occident, organizations and journals in 20th century France. The one you're talking about is one of 3 or 4 I have counted. There was one in 1900, there was one in the 1920s. Again and again, extreme right-wing groups call themselves Occident. So exactly, it's a very contested term, and it's quite daft politically to let one side own it and take all the credit of its associations, of which I was talking about, just because you don't like the people who use it right now. Call them out.
So as the French colloquially say, it's a concept à toutes les sauces. It's used in every sauce. And that is the appropriate moment, 20 minutes before the end of the session, to open the floor to all of you for your thoughts, comments, and questions. So who will break the ice here? Okay, there we go.
So thank you very much.
Introduce
My
yourself.
question would be, when you begin your thought with Comte, why don't you go back rather to the Protestant thinker like Immanuel Kant with this idea of self-determination, and why not highlight this, let's say, origin of the West, that it is the countries that allows this concept of self-determination based on moral philosophy. So I find it much more easier than with a much more Catholic background philosophers. So why don't go back to Kant? So
Thank you. Shall I answer?
Yes, please go ahead.
You can go back to an awful lot of philosophers and thinkers, all the way back to the pre-Socratics, and find the essence of what you understand as the West today. That's not my genre. My genre is to study the idea of the West as a self-description, as a concept, and to study what work it does in the political debates of these people, what intentions people have when they use the West, and what happens, who prevails in these debates, and so on. So Kant did not try to impose the term the West in a systematic way. For example, Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche is a fascinating thinker, but Nietzsche was thinking obsessively in terms of North-South. As Spengler said correctly, he was the last victim of the South. Except in the twilight of the idols, he uses the West once. Where does he use it? In juxtaposition to Russia. When he starts talking, Russia is the only country that thinks long-term and not in the Kleinstaaterei way in which we think. And that makes a lot of work in my chapter 2, which is that the West was used in the 19th century more and more as of the 1820s by people who wanted to build some kind of defense against the fear of the Russian Empire. Alexander I became extremely successful and popular in Central and Western Europe through his various spiritualist contacts and also ideas in putting Russia, not only Russia had been put on the map of Europe politically and culturally by Peter the Great, but Alexander puts it at the very center of the European system with his defeat of Napoleon, his role there, and then his role at the Congress of Vienna and the creation of the Holy Alliance. And he insists on the wording Christian nation and so on. Suddenly the Orthodox, anathema for de Maistre and de Bonal and all sorts of people, and Saint-Simon and Comte, the Orthodox become part of us. And so some people begin to worry about that. Another thing is completely political considerations, that Russia is a huge empire, and the Western European states, if they are divided, they will be devoured. This is an anxiety Rousseau had in the 1860s, if you look at the Contrat Social. Goldsmith, an Irish novelist, writes about that same time before Rousseau. So that is what I'm studying. Why do they need a new term? And I know the difference between the term and the concept. You can study the history of a term and the history of a concept separately. Part of my argument is Heidegger was right when he said it's only when the word for a thing is invented that the thing becomes a thing. There is something about that. There is something to that. The new word creates different associations sooner or later. And that's, I hope I answered the question.
Okay. Yes, please. Do introduce yourself, please.
I'm Julie Klinger. I'm a geographer, and I have a question about time. It really struck me how you're talking about the ideas of the linear progression of time, but also the West as a kind of idea that also has an endpoint, imagines itself as an endpoint. And that seems to me to be such an interesting paradox, right? Progressive, but then also aspiring to a kind of stasis. And so I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your book, but I'd be interested to know a little bit more about how these philosophers deal with the temporal dimensions of their ideas? Thank you.
Thanks very much. A brilliant question. I won't do it justice only because I won't have time, but I'm talking about different things, different people saying different things. So Spengler, of course, criticizes all this, what I've just said, what you said, I said, and says this is hubristic. Like every other civilization, we are going to go down. We have already started. As of 1800, roughly, we have stopped being a culture, and we have become a civilization, which for him, a new twist to the meanings of the term, which is not the same thing as what Thomas Mann was talking about in his Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen in 1918, but something else. He gives it a temporal meaning, and he says, we have now become civilization, which means petrified, nothing original is produced. We are like the Romans compared to the Greeks. So the Western culture ended around the beginning of the 19th century. He criticizes that to say it's hubristic and we're just going to go down, and progress, there is no such thing. He thought in terms of cycles of civilization. Kant wants to stop all this because he thinks it leads to constant revolutions and individualism and so on. So there is not a particular consensus. John Stuart Mill, seen by John Gray and all sorts of people as the great apostle of belief in progress, proposes in principles of political economy, not in an obscure letter, in principles of political economy, he proposes we have to stop growth and the obsession with growth. It's not an ideal for humanity. And he proposes the stationary state. We have to stop being obsessed with growth because we'll destroy the planet. And there will be no forests to go to and contemplate wild natural beauty. And we should only be interested in progress, in moral and intellectual and cultural progress, not in terms of how to populate more and create more people and build more buildings and so on. So different people have different attitudes to it. Thank you. Wonderful question.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Auguste K and I'm a journalist. I would be more interested in, have you studied current protest movements in, for example, in the Middle East or in countries like Iran or in Afghanistan that use the idea of the West still as either as a place that they try to aspire to become, or as a counter narrative that we need to find a domestic version of this Western idea, but in the Afghan context, in the Iranian context?
Wonderful question. The quick answer is no, because how long do you want my book to be? And how many languages do I need to learn? I only speak a small number of languages, so I follow. But the book is, more seriously, the book is about the West as a self-description. When do people start calling themselves the West? Of course, you cannot get away with that, because when Rabindranath Tagore becomes the greatest intellectual celebrity of Europe between 1913 and his death in 42, you can't ignore Tagore. Tagore was, everybody was talking about Tagore. Kaiserling would invite him in the Schule der Weisheit in Germany and celebrate him and so on. He gives his lectures in Japan and American nationalism. So Tagore, Gandhi, and a great number of African, Afro-American, Francophone, Caribbean intellectuals become part of what the Western self-description debate is. They become part of the debate. So I do include those people. I cannot, first of all, I cannot follow every contemporary use of the term. It would be, my book would never end, literally. I think my book will end, but I was not sure a year ago that it will ever end.
Okay, so question over there.
Yeah. Or it switched on? Yeah. Good afternoon, Ralf Yannick. I have a legal background, and my question obviously relates to that as well. We have a quite long debate concerning the West versus the rest, and whether Western ideas are basically universalist ideas. My initial idea, and I think that's the general assumption, is that there was at a certain point in time a shift when you would no longer say that these are Western ideas, but maybe they are originated in the West, or their origins in the West, or they were more conceptualized in the West, but basically they are universalist. So whether you place the thinkers and ideas that you mentioned, and I have to admit, your book is on my Kindle, but I haven't read it yet, because there are countless others as well. I'm very sorry, but you have now motivated me to read it earlier.
The book is not there yet. Go on.
It is. I downloaded it. Then you're somewhere else.
Anyway, go on.
Then it's the advertisement on my Kindle. Anyhow, what I tried to ask is that when did this shift take place from whether it's a universalist concept or is it a Western one, and it's just the best ones among several concepts out there? Thank you.
I don't know you, but they will think I paid you to ask this question because it's the kind of question I would love to, obviously all depends on the questions because I could give you a long lecture on the things I think are important. This is a terribly important point. One quick answer is the Huntington versus Fukuyama discussion that started in the 90s and continued in the Atlantic magazine that I was talking about after Trump's debate, after Trump's speech. The same question arises. Is the West something that is now modernity and there is no alternative and its kind of model will be universalizable and moreover should be promoted by so-called Western governments, or is the West a distinct civilization that has to learn to live with other civilizations and look after its interests and stop being hubristically universalist, which is also suicidal according to Huntington, yeah? This is the historian speaking. If you ask me if I have a comment myself, I do have a comment. And it reminds me of our neighbor, John Plamenats, who was a Montenegrin political theorist in Oxford, who wrote a little article, Two Types of Nationalism. Probably he wrote it on the envelope on the way to a conference in Australia. Very sweeping, very quick, but profoundly important. And I'm not telling you what he said now. I'm saying I agree with him because the point is there already. If you tell the rest of the world that what you think are good ideas or principles or values, like liberalism or liberty, freedom of sexual orientation, freedom of speech, equality, utilitarianism, utility, happiness, whatever you consider, we may not agree here, but whatever we consider good things, if we call them Western values, what does it mean to the people in the rest of the world who are not considered Western in terms of their own identity? You are losers of history. We, or our ancestors, are winners of history. These are our values, which are better normatively, and you have to accept them. Daft, politically, psychologically. Ivan Krastev has co-authored a book with Stephen Holmes, where one chapter describes how East European and Central European governments felt when they were told what the norms are once they joined the European Union. It's a very, very, very bad idea. So I propose that, yes, as a historian, I will accept that, not only accept, but assert a certain number of things first developed or first flourished or first were combined. I think the right word is first were combined. Very often these ideas came from Egypt, from India, from China, from Phoenicia, but first were combined on the European continent in various parts thereof. And now we cherish some of them, not all. And remember, in the same European continent, Nazism flourished. In the same European continent, the Catholic Church didn't allow people to be homosexuals and so on. But in some countries, these things have changed in recent years and decades. So these values we should promote as universal values and obviously disagree and argue what they are and why they are. But if you call them Western, it's very daft. It's like the Greek nationalists, the extreme idiots, sorry, I am recorded again, but I don't think they're watching this, who of course think the world owes everything to Greece because of the ancient Greeks and what they think the ancient Greeks did and so on. It's daft. But shouldn't the same apply to Western Europe? Because some things first succeeded in Western Europe, does it mean they are now West European or Western values? No. So your question is very brilliant, and that's my brief, I hope, answer.
Thank you. Over there.
Hello, my name is Olga. My question is, can we apply this concept of the West to the Soviet Union and also take in consideration that it was no religion there? And the second question, or this continuation of also all these questions, last questions that what do we have in contrary to this concept of West? still have this important values that you just mentioned right now? What do we have? Because this, as far as I understood this concept of West is also, it's capitalism inside that. It's this development that is, we have to raise economy, we have to do more. So what do we have right now? What can we believe in?
Thank you. Very good questions. On the latter, it's a big question which I cannot do justice to. I will only say, I keep saying, I'm not going to define the West. I am describing the different definitions of people. So obviously, most of them include capitalism. But look, China is also capitalist now. So it's not just a Western thing. It's an economic system. There is huge overlap between the concept of the West and concepts like Europe, Christendom in the past, capitalism, liberal democracy, Anglosphere. But overlap and identification are very different things. And, you know, Paris is not France, and Vienna is not Austria, as you will find out tomorrow in the elections, and so on. I fear. I don't know. I'm told. I'm not an expert. Okay. So, to your earlier question, I have a much shorter and easier answer, which is absolutely brilliant question. The Soviet Union, once the Bolsheviks prevail, the majority of people in Western Europe talk about the re-Asianization of Russia. Russia, which had been forced to Westernize or to Europeanize up to a point and unwillingly by Peter the Great and its czars, is now going back to its Asiatic roots and so on and blah, blah, blah. There was a time of a few years in the 40s when the Soviet Union was talked routinely and explicitly and vociferously as part of Western civilization because of the Second World War. Because of suddenly, whereas initially the moral equation was very clear because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the buddies were on the other side, we are the Western democracies. Suddenly the Western democracies have to be saved by the Soviet Union after it's invaded by Hitler. So because of its enormous sacrifices and its enormous contribution to the victory, for some years it had an enormous prestige, so it was talked of as part of Western civilization. That goes away within months very quickly, and then it becomes the greatest enemy and other with the Cold War. So between 42, 46, 7, the Soviet Union is very much part of Western civilization. There are wonderful novels and so on. I can cite as well as Du Bois and many other people, but things change and it becomes the other for reasons that you can imagine.
I'm reminded we're at the end, but a Russian colleague of ours whom we know and who won't be named here, was asked after the invasion of Ukraine and the turn and closeness to China, and was discussing it, and he said, we Russians will realize after several years that we're not close to China, that in fact we're European. And I think that's an interesting, again, va-et-vient of where Russia is on the Eurasian continent. Georgios, thank you very much. You've touched obviously the surface of your serious and substantive book that we look forward to reading, but I think you've helped us answer some of the questions that we all pose ourselves in the complicated and challenging situation that we find ourselves. So please join me in thanking Georgios.